By the time the High Council realized Earth had not answered a single diplomatic hail in 10 full days, 3 border fleets were missing, 6 relay corridors had gone dark, and the loudest voices in the chamber had already begun accusing each other of treason. The panic did not begin with the silence. It began with what the Council had allowed to happen before it. Everyone in that chamber knew it. They knew it while their aides kept their eyes down and their legal clerks pretended to search precedent. They knew it while the recordings played from the medical convoy Bright Mercy, a white-hulled Terran hospital ship moving under Council seal, its transponder broadcasting neutrality in 9 treaty languages, while wounded civilians from the Ilya frontier lay sedated beneath sterile lights. The Khaled Empire stopped it anyway. Not to inspect, not to detain, to make a point. Their cruisers locked the convoy, vented its escorts with precision rail strikes, boarded the hospital decks, and dragged out Ambassador Elias Vance when he invoked interstellar protection. He was executed on an operating floor while the cameras were still running. Then the Khaled Admiral transmitted a single line to every channel in the sector. Let this teach Earth the difference between commerce and power. The line was crossed in front of everyone. Humanity did not ask for war. Not at first. Earth demanded extradition of the Admiral. It demanded the release of surviving medical personnel. It demanded the Bright Mercy recordings be entered into the Permanent Council record without alteration. The Khaled delegation laughed at the first demand, denied the second, and objected to the third on procedural grounds. They claimed the convoy had been carrying covert intelligence assets. They claimed the ambassador had resisted lawful detention. They claimed the white hull had been painted over a military transport. It was absurd, and everyone knew it was absurd, because 100 species had already watched the raw feed. Then the Council did the thing that doomed the old order. It voted for an inquiry instead of sanctions. It urged restraint on all parties. It temporarily suspended Terran freedom of military movement around the Ilya frontier to prevent escalation. They punished Earth for bleeding in public. The human ambassador did not shout. She did not threaten. She stood in the center ring while the chamber trembled with cross-species chatter, and she asked the Council recorder to mark the vote. Every name attached to every abstention, every refusal, every procedural shelter offered to the Empire. Then she said, very quietly, that humanity acknowledged the ruling. The phrase seemed harmless. It was entered into the record. Some of the older delegates flinched anyway. They had dealt with humans longer than the rest. They knew how much emotion a human voice could hide by going still. Then Ambassador Sato placed her badge on the speaking rail, turned her back on the Council, and walked out while Khaled ministers smiled at one another like predators after a clean kill. Earth answered no further hails after that. At first, the silence was treated as theater. The Council was accustomed to species making symbolic withdrawals, closing embassies for a cycle, recalling diplomats so domestic media could rage about insult and dignity. The Khaled markets barely moved. Their admirals joked that the Terrans were sulking behind their ocean world, drafting sermons about law while real powers decided reality at gunpoint. Several member states privately agreed. Humans were useful, certainly. Efficient, tireless, good at engines, habitat construction, long-haul logistics, battlefield medicine, impossible repairs in ugly places. But they were still newcomers by galactic standards, a species that had arrived late, carrying old trauma and newer ambition, too disciplined to be loved and too pragmatic to be trusted. Their fleet tonnage was respectable, not dominant. Their diplomats were articulate, not feared. Their economy was broad, but broad did not mean decisive. Then day 3 arrived, and the first merchant insurers began to freeze Kaled shipping. The notices were simple. Risk models had changed. Routes once considered stable were now listed as unserviceable due to unknown interdiction factors. No one knew where those models came from until someone checked the underwriting cores. Terran firms, human analytics, human emergency response matrices, human salvage projections. It turned out that for 40 years, while older species mocked Earth's preference for contracts and redundancy, human institutions had quietly become the nervous system behind half the galaxy's commercial confidence. They did not own every ship. They owned the assumptions that let ships move. The Empire dismissed it as economic tantrum and redirected military escorts to key lanes. That lasted 8 hours. Then a Kaled battle group entered the Hadron Transit and found every refuel buoy offline, every navigation beacon transmitting obsolete maps, and every civilian dockmaster on legal strike under a clause buried in 10,000 shipping agreements. Service may be suspended in the event of state-sanctioned piracy against protected medical vessels. Humans had written that clause themselves. By day 4, Terran citizens had vanished from mixed stations across 6 sectors. Not in panic, not in chaos. They simply left. Freight foremen handed over work slates and boarded shuttles. Surgeons completed their final procedures, sterilized their instruments, and walked out of alien hospitals without a word. Navigation engineers sealed reactor rooms, transferred credentials, and departed in organized lines. In embassies and warehouses and orbital dry docks, human personnel disappeared with the calm efficiency of a practiced drill. Their accounts settled, their locks cycled, their workstations were wiped. It was less like a strike than a species inhaling. That was when the old diplomats began to feel cold. Because there were records, if one cared to look. Notes from earlier centuries, from first contact conferences and military observer exchanges, from the strange years when humanity was still proving it belonged. Buried in those archives was a phrase used by a retired Soliri negotiator after a border incident with Terran Marines. "Never celebrate when the humans stop arguing," he had warned. "Debate is their mercy. Silence means they have finished deciding." On day 5, the Council finally voted to send a delegation to Earth. No one answered when they arrived in Sol. That frightened them more than any threat could have. Earth was not dark. The homeworld glowed in blue-white arcs under weather control grids and orbital traffic lights. Shipyards above Luna burned with ordinary industry. Civilian channels continued to broadcast weather, port conditions, educational programming, music, parliamentary notices. But no one would discuss the bright mercy. No one would discuss the Council. Every official response was reduced to courteous administrative language. Your message has been received. Your concerns are noted. There is no further comment at this time. Even the Terran news networks, usually chaotic with argument, had gone eerily factual. Casualty lists, memorial schedules, production reports, fleet readiness updates with nothing else attached. The delegation returned with faces like grave markers. Still, the Council hesitated, because institutions built on procedure always believe delay is wisdom, right up until delay becomes the weapon used against them. Kaled ministers insisted the silence proved weakness. They urged the chamber to make an example of Earth before other younger species got dangerous ideas about defiance. So on day 6, the Empire made its fatal choice. It seized 3 Terran grain carriers in the Vask corridor, declared their cargo strategic contraband, and detained their crews. One ship resisted docking protocol. A Kaled destroyer fired warning shots too close to the drive ring. The transport broke apart with 600 civilian contractors aboard. That was the second line. The line after the line. No one on the council floor laughed after that, because within 19 minutes of the Vask incident, every Kelid military relay from the frontier to the inner marches began receiving the same message on secure and insecure bands alike. It was not a threat. It was an inventory. Every ship class, every station reserve, every food dependency, every fuel bottleneck, every gate maintenance cycle, every colonial governor with a mistress, a gambling debt, or a son serving somewhere they had falsified the records to hide. At the end came a signature block from Terran Strategic Command and a single sentence beneath it. "We know what sustains you. Panic loves numbers. Humans sent numbers." The Empire tried to answer with force. Their Fifth Spear Armada surged toward the Ilya frontier, intending to crush the nearest Terran squadron before the silence could harden into a coalition. It never reached the frontier. As the Armada entered the Narrows, Navigation Authority transferred under emergency priority to a reserve traffic lattice nobody in Kelid Command had ever heard of. That lattice was legal. Council legal, in fact, built decades earlier to let human disaster response fleets override civilian congestion during solar storms and colony collapses. The Empire had approved it because it seemed boring. Beneath the paperwork, Terran engineers had threaded every compliant jump corridor with hard-coded dependence on authentication keys stored in Sol. At the exact center of the Narrows, the Armada's route collapsed into staggered micro-jumps. Formations broke. Supply tenders scattered. Their escorts emerged days apart and light hours from each other into volumes already occupied by waiting Terran hunter groups. Not battles. Extractions. Human ships did not waste motion. Black wedges slid out from shadowed orbits, engines dimmed to knife-thin blue, rail lances punching through drives, sensor masts, magazine feeds. Terran Marines cut into flag bridges with breaching charges shaped so precisely that atmosphere stayed in the compartments the crew could use to surrender. They took admirals alive. They left life support intact. They transmitted casualty care instructions in Kelid military cant. Again and again, the same chilling pattern repeated. Disable, isolate, board, document, withdraw. No speeches, no fury, no triumph. Just competence, weaponized to a level the galaxy had never seen from a species it had called merely industrious. By day 7, the Council understood something humiliating. Humanity had never been trying to look harmless. The galaxy had simply confused restraint with incapacity. The records came next. Not rumors, records. Entire vaults of them released onto public channels across 1,000 worlds. Raw footage from the Bright Mercy. Internal Kelid communications celebrating the hospital seizure as a useful lesson. Lobby exchanges showing which council members had traded sanctions for access to Imperial mineral lanes. Audit trails proving that inquiry panels had been rigged before the first vote was cast. Humans did not merely accuse, they authenticated. Their evidence came layered with chain of custody proofs, redundant mirrors, forensic signatures, and independent third-party verification from systems no one realized Terran contract law had quietly placed under joint oversight years earlier. The old council narrative shattered so completely that even species long aligned with the Empire began closing their ports to Kelid warships. And still, Earth said almost nothing. That silence became the most terrifying sound in known space. On day 8, Terran fleets finally appeared in numbers the galaxy could no longer dismiss. Not from Sol alone, from freight convoys, from tug registries, from survey groups operating beyond mapped gas giants. From colony defense flotillas everyone had counted as local constabulary. Humanity had turned civilian redundancy into strategic depth on a scale that made ancient empires look theatrical. Modular armor locked over cargo hulls. Container racks unfolded into missile forests. Habitat tenders became drone carriers. Rescue craft became electronic warfare platforms. Every boring human vessel the galaxy had taxed, mocked, and ignored suddenly revealed a second identity. For generations, Earth had accepted the glamorous military dominance of older powers while building the infrastructure those powers depended on. They had let others own the throne because they had decided, long ago, to own the floor beneath it. The doctrine had a name that finally leaked from classified Terran channels after the first major reversals: Silent Harbor. The principle was brutally simple. If an enemy attacks under law's protection and the law refuses to answer, withdraw all exposed assets, consolidate all dispersed capacity, blind the attacker to its own dependencies, then strike only when every move from retaliation to reconstruction has already been calculated. Human war, the doctrine insisted, begins long before the first return shot. It begins with making sure the enemy has nowhere stable left to stand. The Empire tried one last gamble. If it could not dominate the lanes, it would terrorize Earth directly. On Day 9, a Kelid deep strike force emerged at the edge of the Sol exclusion zone with enough antimatter tonnage to burn continents. They expected the usual spectacle: hurried hails, orbital shields rising, desperate fleets converging from scattered patrol sectors. Instead, they found a quiet system and a sensor picture so clean it felt unnatural. Luna's yards still burned, Mars traffic still moved, civilian broadcasts still played. No grand armada presented itself, no challenge issued. For 12 long minutes, the strike force advanced into the most famous home system in the galaxy and heard only the hum of their own reactors. Then the dark side of Neptune lit up. Ship after ship rose from shadow where no Kelid planner had believed massed construction could be hidden. Vast hulls, cold and geometric, built around spinal accelerators so long their muzzle glows looked like newborn suns. The Terran First Reserve, absent from every treaty register, unfolded from masked anchorages in the outer system with perfect parade ground spacing. Around them came the rest. Drone veils from the Kuiper yards, missile buses from disguised ice haulers, autonomous mine swarms released from comets the Empire had charted and forgotten. 1,000 civilian signatures in Sol's outer dark abruptly resolved into a fortress designed in patience. The Kelid strike force had not entered a home system. It had entered a prepared verdict. Terran Command sent exactly one transmission. You were warned at law. You were warned at sea. You were warned by our dead. Disarm and drift. The Keled admiral fired. Later, survivors would say the battle felt less like combat than the moment an avalanche decides a mountain has been insulted. Terran fire control was mercilessly selective. Every hostile ship that could still transmit targeting data lost that capacity first. Every vessel trying to break inward toward the inhabited worlds found itself herded by drone clouds into kill geometries already mapped by outer system kinetics. Human missiles did not chase ships. They predicted surrender vectors and cut them off. Autonomous boarding cutters ignored burning wrecks and went for intact command decks. Not a single shot was directed toward lifeboats. Not one toward planetary orbit. The discipline of it broke more nerves than slaughter would have. This was not rage. Rage could be bargained with. This was a species executing a plan it had hoped never to need and had perfected anyway. The strike force died in layers. The ships that survived did so because Terrans allowed surrender windows measured to the second and honored every one of them. That was when the Council began to panic in earnest. Because the implications finally arrived all at once. If Earth had built this in secret, what else had it built? If humanity could dismantle an Imperial strike force at its own doorstep without endangering civilian traffic, what could it do in contested space? If all this had been prepared before the Bright Mercy, then the silence had not been hesitation. It had been activation. Markets collapsed first. Keled bond chains vaporized as colonies realized resupply would not come. Governors pleaded for relief. Relief came, but not from the Empire. Terran aid ships entered starving systems under armed escort and distributed food from the very grain carriers Keled patrols had seized. Human doctors treated alien civilians while human prosecutors documented mass theft of medical supplies by Imperial garrisons. On station after station, local populations watched the species branded as unstable newcomers behave with more order, more lawful conduct, and more precision than the regime that had ruled them for centuries. Human Marines took arsenals and left schools untouched. They cut power to fortresses and restored it to hospitals. They captured governors at breakfast and kept their city water running by lunch. That contrast spread faster than any fleet. The Empire began to fracture. Whole client species renounced their defense compacts. 2 Keled sector admirals mutinied rather than obey scorched orbit orders against rebellious colonies. A third tried to rally a final stand around the throne world and discovered his logistics codes had been invalid for 40 hours. Terran's cyber units had not merely infiltrated Imperial systems. They had waited, patient and silent, until every backup trust chain led back to a dependency some complacent procurement office had once outsourced to a human firm because humans were cheaper and more reliable. Reliability, the galaxy learned too late, can become absolute leverage if the reliable party is betrayed hard enough. On day 10, Earth finally spoke to the Council. Every screen in the chamber came alive at once. Not with flags, not with martial music. With the recovered operating room feed from the Bright Mercy, paused on Ambassador Vance standing blood-splashed between Keled rifles and a table full of sedated children from the Ilia camps. He had been unarmed. He had still put himself in the way. The room was silent except for machine alarms. Then the image shifted to Secretary General Mara Okonkwo, seated alone at a plain desk, hands folded, expression unreadable. For 10 days, she said, humanity refrained from answering insult with impulse. We counted our dead. We extracted our people. We secured our civilians. We mapped every legal failure that made piracy possible under your seal. We gave the Empire time to surrender its criminals. We gave this council time to remember what law is for. You used that time to hide, to equivocate, and to pray we were merely offended. She leaned forward very slightly. We were not offended. Then came the terms. Immediate dissolution of the inquiry and creation of a war crimes tribunal under open record. Unconditional surrender of every officer involved in the Bright Mercy seizure and the Vask killings. Suspension of council voting privileges for states proven to have obstructed justice. Demilitarization of Keled frontier sectors under multinational supervision led by neutral powers and enforced by Terran fleets until civilian governance stabilized. Safe conduct protections rewritten with automatic collective response clauses, so no hospital ship or diplomatic convoy could ever again be sacrificed to procedure. The terms were severe. They were also lawful, meticulously justified, and impossible to refute without defending the indefensible. No one in the chamber found the courage to refuse. The Keled emperor tried, of course. He broadcast from a bunker palace lined with ancestral iron and promised a war of generations, a cleansing fire, the ruin of every human colony from Sol to the Rim. While he spoke, Terran forces released a live orbital feed above his capital. No bombs fell. No invasion pods dropped. The camera simply widened to reveal that the palace, its defense rings, and every launch site on the continent sat within overlapping target solutions from ships the Imperial Court had failed to detect. It was the purest expression of power the galaxy had ever witnessed, the ability to end a dynasty and the decision not to, because killing it would be easier than proving it beaten. By dusk, half the palace guard had defected. By dawn, the emperor was in cuffs, delivered alive by his own generals to a tribunal shuttle under Terran escort. The war ended not with a last stand, but with a last realization. Humanity had not won because it was the strongest species in a crude sense. Other civilizations still possessed larger populations, older fleets, stranger weapons, deeper history. Humanity had won because it had understood something the old powers had forgotten. Systems matter more than thrones. Discipline matters more than spectacle. And law, if it is to mean anything at all, must be defended by people willing to make violators fear the consequences more than they desire the crime. In the months that followed, the galaxy tried to rename what had happened. Some called it the 10-day crisis. Others called it the Sol demonstration, the Keled collapse, the Tribunal War. Human veterans used none of those names. Among themselves, with the grim humor of a species that survives by containing its fire until the exact necessary second, they called it the Quiet Week, even though it had lasted longer and cost too much. They rebuilt what they had broken. They repaired lanes they had shut. They returned captured ships, stripped only of weapons and evidence. They escorted relief convoys to worlds that had cheered their enemies. They did not ask for gratitude. They did not need it. Recognition came anyway. The new council chamber was smaller, less ornate, harder to hide in. At its center hung the scorched transponder core of the Bright Mercy, preserved behind clear alloy, still broadcasting the medical neutrality code that had once been ignored. Every delegate entering the chamber passed beneath it. Every vote occurred in its shadow. And on the first session of the reformed body, when the speaker asked which state would assume emergency stewardship of the revised protection accords until the tribunal process was complete, not one government objected when Earth accepted. No one laughed at humans after that. No one called them merely industrious, or young, or sentimental about law. The species that had once been patronized for building the roads was now understood as the one that decided whether roads remained open at all. School texts on 100 worlds changed their language. Military academies added entire departments on Terran doctrine. Diplomats learned to fear not the human temper, but its absence. Because everybody now knew what 10 days of silence meant. It meant factories beneath moon rock. It meant fleets hidden in freight registries. It meant casualty lists read in perfect calm while targeting solutions bloomed in the dark. It meant you had already been measured and found dependent. And somewhere in the archived records of the tribunal, preserved for every future government stupid enough to mistake patience for weakness, there remained one final clip from the Bright Mercy. Not the execution, not the boarding. The moment just before the Keled soldiers dragged Ambassador Vance away, when one of the surgeons, hands shaking with blood on her gloves, asked him what Earth would do now. He looked at the rifles. He looked at the children on the tables. Then he answered with the flat certainty of a man who already knew exactly what his species was. "They'll be quiet," he said, "and then you'll wish they weren't." The galaxy never made that mistake again.